At 6:47 on the morning of October 25, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland stood on the bridge of the USS Samuel B. Roberts, squinting against the early light reflecting off the Philippine Sea. He was 34 years old, a man who, in civilian life, had been a successful lawyer, but today he was the master of a vessel that the United States Navy classified as a destroyer escort. To the sailors who manned her, she was simply a tin can, a term of both endearment and terrifying accuracy. The Samuel B. Roberts, or the Sammy B, as her crew called her, was never designed for the hammer-and-tongs brutality of a surface-line battle. She was built for a singular, unglamorous purpose: to hunt submarines and protect slow-moving convoys from the shadows of the deep. Her hull was constructed of 3/8-inch non-ballistic steel, plating metal so thin that a heavy machine gun could practically chew through it, and a major naval shell would pass through both sides without even detonating, as if the ship were made of wet paper. The air that morning was thick with the scent of salt spray and the low hum of the ship's 2 boilers. The Roberts was part of a small, unassuming task unit known by its radio call sign Taffy 3. This unit consisted of 6 small escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 tiny destroyer escorts like the Roberts. They were the lightweight defenders of the massive American invasion force landing at Leyte Gulf. Their job was to provide air support for the troops on the beaches and keep a watchful eye for Japanese subs. It was supposed to be a routine morning. The sun was rising, the sea was relatively calm, and the men were finishing their morning coffee, thinking about breakfast. But in the distance, poking through the horizon like the fingers of a submerged giant, strange shapes began to emerge. Copeland watched through his binoculars as the silhouettes sharpened. These weren't the friendly masts of the American 7th Fleet. They were the distinct, towering pagoda masts of the Imperial Japanese Navy. An American pilot from one of the escort carriers crackled over the radio, his voice frantic and breaking through the static. He reported the impossible: the Japanese center force, a massive fleet of battleships and heavy cruisers that was supposed to have been turned back by airstrikes the day before, was now less than 20 miles away and closing fast. The contrast in power was not just significant, it was absurd. Leading the Japanese charge was the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, a 65,000-ton monster armed with 9 18-inch guns. A single shell from the Yamato weighed as much as a small car. Behind her trailed 3 more battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and a swarm of destroyers. To put this in perspective, the entire Taffy 3 task unit combined did not have the firepower or the armor of just one of the Japanese heavy cruisers. The Samuel B. Roberts carried exactly to 5-inch guns, 1 on the bow and 1 on the stern. These guns were designed to fend off aircraft or harass a surface submarine. Against the steel-belted armor of a Japanese cruiser, they were effectively pea shooters. If you want to understand how a crew of 200 men on a ship meant for coastal patrol decided to face down the most powerful surface fleet on the planet, please hit that like button. It helps us tell the stories of these small ships that changed the course of history. As the Japanese fleet opened fire, the sea around Taffy 3 erupted into a nightmare of technicolor geysers. The Japanese used colored dyes in their shells to help their spotters identify where each ship's fire was landing red. Yellow, green, and blue splashes rose hundreds of feet into the air, surrounding the vulnerable American carriers. Admiral Sprague, the commander of Taffy 3, realized instantly that his slow jeep carriers could not outrun the Japanese. They were trapped. If the Japanese closed the distance, the carriers and the thousands of men on board would be obliterated in minutes. On the bridge of the Samuel B. Roberts, Copeland looked at his men. He knew the tactical manuals by heart. The manual said a destroyer escort should stay back, provide smoke screens, and protect the carriers as they fled. But Copeland also knew the math of the situation. If someone didn't slow the Japanese down, everyone was going to die. He picked up the ship's intercom. His voice was steady, the voice of a man making a closing argument in a courtroom where the stakes were life and death. He told his crew that they were going into a fight against overwhelming odds, from which they likely would not return. He told them he expected every man to do his duty. Then he did the unthinkable. He didn't order a retreat. He didn't wait for orders. He gave the command, full speed ahead. Intercept, the Samuel B. Roberts, turned out of the formation, moving away from the safety of the carriers and directly toward the line of Japanese heavy cruisers. It was a suicide run, a David and Goliath confrontation where David didn't even have a sling, just a very fast, very thin boat. But this is where the story shifts from a tragedy into a feat of engineering defiance. The Samuel B. Roberts was officially rated for a maximum speed of 24 knots. In the world of naval warfare, 24 knots is respectable for a cargo escort, but it is agonizingly slow when you are trying to dodge shells from cruisers that can hit 25 or 30 knots. To survive long enough to even get within range to fire his torpedoes, Copeland needed speed. He needed his ship to do something it was never designed to do. Deep in the belly of the ship, in the sweltering, oil-slicked environment of the engine room, Chief Machinist's mate Bill Bullard and his crew received the order for flank speed. They could hear the muffled thuds of shells hitting the water outside. They knew the ship was charging into the heart of the Japanese fleet. Bullard looked at his gauges. The needles were already vibrating at the edge of the white zone. He knew that to give Copeland the speed he needed, they would have to break the ship. In a standard naval operation, boilers are governed by safety valves and strict operational limits. If you push the pressure too high, the pipes burst, the boilers explode, and the ship becomes a floating coffin of scalding steam. But Bullard and his black gang of engineers decided that the safety limits were for peacetime. Armed with wrenches and a desperate kind of courage, they began to manually screw down the safety valves. They bypassed the limiters that were designed to prevent the engines from tearing themselves apart. The heat in the engine room climbed to over 130 degrees. The vibrations became so intense that the sailors had to wrap their hands in rags to touch the controls. They were redlining the entire ship. As they pushed more and more fuel into the fires, the Roberts began to vibrate with a frequency that made the deck plates hum under the men's boots. On the bridge, the speedometer began to climb. 24 knots, 25, 26. The hull of the ship, built of that thin 3/8-inch steel, began to groan as the force of the water hammered against the bow. The ship reached 28 knots 4 knots over its theoretical maximum. It doesn't sound like much on land, but in the water, it was a miracle. The Samuel B. Roberts was now moving faster than any destroyer escort had ever moved in the history of the Navy. This unexpected burst of speed did something crucial. It completely threw off the Japanese rangefinders. The Japanese gunners were trained professionals. They had charts and tables that told them exactly how much to lead a target based on its class. They saw a destroyer escort, and their brains told them 24 knots. They aimed their massive guns where they thought the Roberts would be, but the Sammy B wasn't there. She was 4 knots further ahead, skipping across the waves like a stone. As the Roberts closed the gap, the scale of the Japanese ships became terrifyingly clear. The heavy cruiser Chokai loomed out of the mist, 10 times the size of the Roberts. The Chokai was a beautiful, lethal machine of war, bristling with 8-inch guns that could delete the Roberts from existence with a single salvo. But the Roberts kept coming. She was so small and moving so fast that the Japanese lookouts were momentarily confused. They couldn't believe a ship that tiny was attacking them alone. Copeland waited. He needed to get within 5,000 yards, nearly point-blank range in naval terms, to fire his torpedoes. If he fired too early, the Japanese would see the wakes and turn away. If he waited too long, the Chokai's secondary batteries would shred him. The Roberts was now so close that the crew could see the Japanese sailors on the decks of the cruiser. The Samuel B was vibrating so hard from its overpressurized engines that the men on the guns found it difficult to aim, but they held their positions. Then came the moment of the inciting incident, the heartbeat where the laws of war seemed to bend. As the Roberts closed to within 4,000 yards, the Chokai's massive 8-inch turrets began to rotate. They were so close that the Japanese gunners had to depress their barrels to their absolute minimum, angled to try and hit the waterline of the tiny American ship. But there was a technical flaw in the Japanese design. The massive guns were designed to fight other giants miles away. They literally could not point low enough to hit the Roberts at such a close range. The shells from the Chokai began to scream over the Roberts' mastheads, splashing harmlessly into the sea on the other side. The tiny Escort had slipped inside the giant's reach. It was the naval equivalent of a featherweight boxer getting so close to a heavyweight that the heavyweight couldn't extend his arms to punch. For a few impossible minutes, the Samuel B. Roberts was untouchable. Copeland shouted the order, "Fire." The Roberts launched its spread of torpedoes. The steel tubes hissed as the fish hit the water, streaking toward the Chokai. At the same time, the two 5-inch guns of the Roberts' little pea-shooters began to bark. Because they were so close, the American gunners weren't aiming for the hull. They were aiming for the bridge, the radio masts, and the unarmored superstructures. They were raking the Japanese cruiser with everything they had, including anti-aircraft 40mm and 20mm cannons. The sound was a continuous, deafening roar of mechanical defiance. The Japanese were in shock. They were being hammered by a ship they should have destroyed 10 minutes ago. They were being peppered by machine gun fire from a vessel that didn't even have armor. To the Japanese commanders on the Chokai, it didn't feel like they were fighting a destroyer escort. It felt like they were fighting a phantom ship that refused to follow the rules of physics or the protocols of war. This was the birth of the legend of the Ghost of Samar, a tiny tin can that had turned itself into a pressurized bomb and dared the Imperial Navy to try and catch it. But as the torpedoes raced through the water and the engines of the Roberts screamed in protest, the cost of this defiance was about to come due. By 7:35 on the morning of October 25, 1944, the sea around the USS Samuel B. Roberts had become a churning cauldron of smoke and high explosives. The torpedoes that Lieutenant Commander Copeland had ordered launched were now streaking through the water toward the Japanese heavy cruiser Chokai. One of those torpedoes struck home, a massive explosion rippling through the cruiser's hull, momentarily staggering the giant. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the crew of the tiny Samuel B felt a surge of triumph. They had done the impossible. A ship built for escorting merchant vessels had just wounded a heavy cruiser of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But that triumph was quickly tempered by a terrifying reality. They had just poked the hornet's nest, and the hornets were now fully awake. The Japanese fleet, initially confused by the sudden and aggressive charge of a single small vessel, began to adjust. The invincibility that the Roberts had enjoyed by being too close for the main batteries to depress was a fragile shield. While the massive 18-inch and 8-inch guns might have struggled to find the waterline of the small ship, the Japanese cruisers and destroyers were equipped with secondary batteries 6-inch and 5-inch, guns that were perfectly capable of reaching down and crushing a thin-skinned escort. The water around the Roberts was no longer just filled with technicolor geysers from distant misses. It was being shredded by a hail of smaller caliber shells and machine gun fire. On the bridge, Copeland felt the ship shudder. It wasn't a direct hit yet, but the near misses were sending jagged shards of shrapnel through the air like lethal hail. The thin steel of the Roberts superstructure was being peppered, the metal screaming as it was torn apart. Copeland looked at his men, and what he saw was the transformation of fear into a singular, mechanical focus. There was no room for panic when every second required a life-saving decision. If you can appreciate the sheer nerves required to stand on a bridge made of thin metal while heavy cruisers try to erase you, please take a second to hit that like button. It helps us keep the memory of these men and their incredible courage alive. Deep inside the ship, the situation was becoming a technical nightmare. The boilers, still being pushed far beyond their red lines by Bill Bullard's engineering crew, were groaning under the strain. The pressure gauges were no longer just in the red. The needles were vibrating against the physical pins of the dials. The heat in the engine room had become an entity of its own, a thick, suffocating weight that made every breath feel like inhaling fire. The engineers were working in a world of shadows and steam, knowing that a single hit to their section would turn the entire space into a pressure cooker from which there was no escape. They weren't just running an engine. They were maintaining a controlled explosion. The Samuel B. Roberts was now the primary target for several Japanese ships. The heavy cruiser Chikuma and the battleship Kongu had turned their attention toward the tin can that refused to die. The sky was black with smoke, lit only by the staccato flashes of the Roberts' two 5-inch guns. These guns, designated Gun 51 at the bow and Gun 52 at the stern, were being fired with a ferocity that defied their design. The official manual for the Mark 12 5-inch gun suggested a sustained rate of fire of about 15 rounds per minute. The crew of the Roberts, fueled by pure adrenaline and the knowledge that their lives depended on the weight of lead they could throw, were pushing that rate to 20, then 25 rounds per minute. The loaders were moving in a blurred, rhythmic dance, catching the heavy brass casings as they ejected, their gloves smoking from the heat. At Gun 52, a sailor named Paul Henry was leading his crew with a calm that bordered on the supernatural. They were firing so fast that the paint on the gun barrels began to blister and peel away in charred flakes. The barrels themselves were glowing a dull, angry red in the morning light. They were outshooting the Japanese cruisers, round for round, because they had to. It was during this phase of the battle that a strange, almost miraculous phenomenon occurred, something naval historians would later call the miracle of over-penetration. The Japanese were firing armor-piercing shells designed to sink massive battleships. These shells were fused to explode only after they had punched through several inches of hardened steel armor. But the Samuel B. Roberts had no armor. When those massive shells struck the Roberts, they didn't explode. They simply punched clean through one side of the ship and out the other, leaving neat, jagged holes in the hull and superstructure. In some cases, shells passed through the crew's living quarters, through the mess hall, and out into the sea, leaving nothing but a whistling wind in their wake. Had the Roberts been a more powerful ship with thicker skin, those shells would have detonated, blowing the vessel to pieces instantly. Her very weakness had become a strange kind of armor, but the luck of over-penetration could only last so long. As the Roberts zigzagged through the water, laying down a thick screen of chemical smoke to hide the carriers, the mechanical strain began to take its toll. The ammunition hoists, never intended for this kind of continuous high-speed operation, began to jam. The gun crews had to resort to forming human chains, passing the heavy 54-pound shells by hand from the magazines deep in the ship up to the decks. They were slipping on spilled oil and blood, their muscles screaming, but the guns never stopped barking. Inside the mind of every man on that ship, a transformation was occurring. The initial terror of the morning had been replaced by a grim, fatalistic determination. There was a sense that they were already ghosts, that the ship was already lost, and all that remained was to see how much damage they could inflict before the end. This internal monologue wasn't one of despair, but of a fierce, defiant pride. They were the small ship that the giants couldn't kill. They were the tin can that was holding back the pride of the Imperial Navy. Then, the situation shifted from desperate to impossible. The Roberts was running out of ammunition. In less than an hour of sustained combat, the Samuel B. Roberts had fired over 600 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. The lockers were emptying. The magazine crews reported that they were down to their last few crates of armor-piercing shells. Copeland, standing on his shredded bridge, gave an order that highlighted the sheer absurdity of the battle. He ordered the gunners to switch to whatever they had left. They began firing high-explosive shells meant for shore bombardment. When those ran out, they began firing anti-aircraft shells equipped with proximity fuses. And finally, in a move of total desperation, they began loading star shells, illumination rounds designed to light up the night sky. These shells had no explosive power against a ship. They were essentially giant magnesium candles. But when they hit the Japanese cruisers, they burst into blinding white-hot flares of light, spraying burning magnesium across the decks and into the eyes of the Japanese bridge crews. To the Japanese, this was the final proof that they were fighting a madman. They couldn't understand the tactics. They couldn't calculate the speed. And now they were being blinded by a ship that seemed to be firing fireworks at them in broad daylight. This was the turning point of the engagement for the Samuel B. R. Roberts. The Japanese, frustrated by the tiny ship's persistence and blinded by its desperate choice of ammunition, began to close in for the kill. The heavy cruiser Tone joined the fray, along with the Kongu. They stopped using armor-piercing rounds and switched to high-explosive shells, shells designed to explode on contact with even the thinnest surface. The miracle of over-penetration was over. At 8:50 a.m., a massive 14-inch shell from the battleship Kongu struck the Roberts near the stern. The impact was cataclysmic. The shell didn't pass through this time. It exploded with the force of a falling building. The explosion ripped through the after-engine room, instantly killing every man in the black gang who had worked so hard to keep the pressure up. The ship's power failed instantly. The lights went out, the screaming whine of the turbines died into a haunting silence, and the Samuel B. Roberts began to lose her incredible speed. She was dead in the water, a smoking wreck surrounded by the giants she had dared to challenge. But even as the ship began to settle into the water, and even as the Japanese cruisers circled like sharks sensing blood, the guns of the Roberts didn't stop. Gun 52, the stern gun where Paul Henry and his crew had been working, was still operational. They had no power, no hoists, and the deck was slanted at a terrifying angle, but they were still loading by hand. They were still firing. The Japanese could not believe what they were seeing. A ship that was clearly sinking, a ship that had been hammered by shells larger than its own engines, was still spitting fire. It was at this moment that the Japanese Admiral Kurita, observing the battle from the bridge of the Yamato, began to lose his nerve. He looked at the smoking wreck of the Roberts. He looked at the other destroyers of Taffy 3 that were performing similar suicide charges, and he came to a fateful conclusion. He believed he was not fighting a small task unit of escorts. He believed he had stumbled into the main strength of the American Third Fleet. He believed that only a much larger, more powerful force would have the audacity to fight with such reckless, terrifying intensity. The Samuel B. Roberts was dying, but in her death throes, she was projecting an image of power that was fundamentally changing the strategic mind of the Japanese High Command. The ghost of Samar was about to perform its final, most important act, even as the sea began to claim the thin steel plates of its hull. At 9:05 on the morning of October 25, 1944, the USS Samuel B. Roberts was no longer a ship in the functional sense of the word. It was a floating charnel house of twisted steel and localized heroism. The 14-inch shell from the battleship Kongu had essentially deleted the ship's stern, and the overpressurized boilers, the very heart of the vessel that had pushed it to 28 knots, had, finally, succumbed to the violence. The engine rooms were flooded with seawater and scalding steam, and the once vibrant hum of the turbines had been replaced by the haunting, metallic groans of a dying predator. Yet, amid the smoke and the listing deck, one sound continued to pierce the chaos: the rhythmic, defiant boom of Gun 52. The stern gun, commanded by Paul Henry, had become the soul of the Samuel B. Roberts. Even with the power out, even as the deck tilted at a sickening 20-degree angle toward the port side, the crew of Gun 52 refused to stop. They were loading the 54-pound shells by hand, timing their movements with the roll of the dying ship. They had fired over 300 rounds more than the gun's entire lifespan was supposed to allow. When the ammunition hoists failed, they didn't wait. They formed a human chain through the fire and the blood. When the armor-piercing rounds were gone, they fired the star shells, and when a final Japanese shell struck the mount, it didn't just stop the gun, it turned the turret into a tomb. When rescue teams finally reached the gun mount, after the order to abandon ship was given, they found Paul Henry, the man who had led them through the impossible, slumped over the breach. In his arms, he was still clutching a final 5-inch shell. He had been trying to load one last round into a gun that was already destroyed. A final act of mechanical and human defiance that defined the spirit of the Sammy B. He died exactly as he had fortrifiusing, to believe that the limits of his equipment or his body were the end of the story. Lieutenant Commander Copeland stood on the bridge, looking out at the carnage. He knew the end had come. The ship was settling fast, the bow rising as the stern was swallowed by the Philippine Sea. He gave the most difficult order a commander can give: abandon ship. He stayed until the last possible moment, ensuring that his men had life jackets and rafts, even as the Japanese cruisers Tone and Chikuma continued to fire on the sinking wreck. If you want to see the true cost of this kind of bravery, please hit that like button. It's not just about the ships. It's about the 89 men of the Roberts who would never see home again. As the Samuel B. Roberts slipped beneath the waves at 10:05 a.m., something strange happened. The Japanese cruiser Tone, which had been the Roberts' primary antagonist for the last hour, slowed down. The Japanese sailors lined the rails. Instead of firing on the men in the water, as was sometimes the brutal practice of the era, many of the Japanese sailors saluted. They had watched a tiny escort ship charge a line of heavy cruisers, endure a battering that would have sunk a battleship, and continue to fire until its last gun was physically blown apart. Even the enemy had to acknowledge that they had just witnessed a level of courage that defied the logic of war. But for the survivors of the Roberts, the ordeal was only beginning. For the next 50 hours, nearly 200 men drifted in the shark-infested waters of the Philippine Sea. Because of the chaotic nature of the battle and the fact that Taffy 3 was essentially a forgotten unit in the larger strategic picture, rescue did not come immediately. They drifted in oil-slicked water, their skin blistering under the tropical sun, fighting off exhaustion and the predators of the deep. They shared what little water they had, sang songs to keep each other awake, and watched as their comrades succumbed to wounds and the elements. Of the 210 men who had gone into battle that morning, only 121 would be pulled from the water. While the men of the Roberts were fighting for their lives in the water, the strategic impact of their sacrifice was rippling through the Japanese High Command. Admiral Kurita, the man in charge of the massive center force, was a shaken man. He had seen the Samuel B. Roberts and the other destroyers of Taffy 3 attack with such ferocity that he was convinced he was facing the entire American Third Fleet. He had lost 3 heavy cruisers, the Chikai, the Chikuma, and the Mogami there sunk or crippled during the engagement. He looked at the horizon, fearing that at any moment the real American battleships would appear to finish him off. In one of the most controversial and decisive moves of the Pacific War, Kurita ordered his massive fleet to turn around. He retreated. He had the American invasion force at Leyte Gulf completely vulnerable. But the ghost of Samar, the memory of a tiny ship that wouldn't die and wouldn't stop firing, had convinced him that the cost of proceeding was too high. The Samuel B. Roberts, a ship made of thin steel and powered by red-lint boilers, had effectively won a battle against the largest battleship in history by simply refusing to acknowledge its own insignificance. The resolution of this story, however, carries a touch of that bureaucratic injustice that so often follows technical innovation in war. In the immediate aftermath, the focus was on the carrier pilots and the high-ranking admirals. The Samuel B. C. Roberts was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, and Copeland received the Navy Cross. But for decades, the specific technical miracle of the Samuel B. remained a footnote in naval history. The engineering feat of Bill Bullard and his black gang, the men who manually overrode the safety valves to turn the ship into a 28-knot Phantom, was largely kept in the shadows of official reports. It was a violation of standard operating procedure that had saved an entire task unit. Yet the Navy wasn't keen on encouraging other crews to bypass their safety limiters. For over 70 years, the Samuel B. Roberts lay in the darkness of the abyss, forgotten by everyone except the veterans who had survived her, and the historians who marveled at the lopsided statistics of the Battle of Samar. But in 2022, the ghost returned to the headlines. An expedition led by Victor Vesevo located the wreck of the Roberts. She was found resting at a depth of 22,621 feet, more than 4 miles down. At the time of her discovery, she was the deepest shipwreck ever identified. The images returned by the deep-sea submersibles were haunting. Despite the crushing pressure and the decades in the dark, the Samuel B. Roberts was remarkably intact. You could still see the holes where the Japanese shells had passed through her thin hull. You could see the ruined mounts of Gun 52. She looked exactly as she had when she went down, a small, battered fighter that had refused to surrender. The discovery validated everything the survivors had said for decades. It showed a ship that had been literally torn apart by fire, but had remained a cohesive unit until the very end. The legacy of the Samuel B. Roberts isn't found in the thickness of its armor or the caliber of its guns. It is found in the intersection of human audacity and mechanical defiance. It is a story that proves that innovation doesn't always come from a laboratory or a government contract. Sometimes it comes from a chief engineer with a wrench and a commander who refuses to follow a manual that says his death is inevitable. The Samuel B was a ship that was never meant to be a legend, yet it became the ultimate symbol of the tin can sailors, men who went to sea in thin-skinned boats and took on the giants of the earth. As we look back at the ghost of Samar, the lesson is universal. It tells us that your rated capacity is only a suggestion. Whether it's a red-linned boiler in 1944 or a challenge you face today, the limits of what you can achieve are often defined by your willingness to bypass the safety valves of your own fear. The Samuel B. Roberts eventually sank, but it died as a victor, proving that in the heat of war, a rule-breaking crew and a ship pushed to the point of explosion are more dangerous than a fleet of giants. If this story of the tin can that fought like a battleship moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe. Every like helps us ensure that the names of men like Robert Copeland, Bill Bullard, and Paul Henry are never forgotten by history. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. You from a naval family, or did you just learn about the Roberts today? We want to hear from you. You're not just a viewer. You're part of the crew keeping these memories alive. This was the story of the Ghost of Samar, a small ship with a giant soul. Thank you for watching.